It's hot as a witch's box in New York City right now, and I love it. I live in New York, but I was spawned in our great nation's 51st state, the low country of South Carolina, where the four seasons are summer, hurricane, Christmas, and azalea. I go down south a lot, even more these days, to see our kids in college. In fact, we just dropped our son off, and now Katie and I are empty nesters. It feels weird to say those words. It's funny how the mind works. As I hugged him goodbye, I was flooded with memories of soap bubbles sliding down his tiny back into bathwater, and buying school supplies, which my mom always said was her favorite memory. I realize that the sorrow in seeing them grow up speaks directly to the depth of our bond. And then I feel full again, as if we've raised two kind human beings. What does this have to do with painting? Everything. Life isn't a support system for art, but the other way around. Art doesn't give, it takes. Art fails us. It is lifeless and incomplete. We project our vitality into it, and in return, it compensates us for life's impermanence. By magnifying its own limitations, its artifice, art shows us that perfection is not possible. It's the longing that matters. Therein lies the source of all art, unfulfilled longing. Winnie the Pooh said his favorite thing isn't getting honey, but that moment when he might get honey. Something can only come to life when we can't have it. On the flight back to New York City, I remembered a Robert Frost poem. Nature's first green is gold, her hardest hue to hold. Her early leaf's a flower, but only so an hour. Then leaf subsides to leaf. So Eden sank to grief. So dawn goes down today. Nothing gold can stay. I can't think of a more apt description of painting. Hey, come over here. I have something to show you. Let's wander through the 19th century European painting wing in the Metropolitan Museum of Art for a bit. This is Theodore Rousseau's Forest in Winter at Sunset, completed in 1867. Years ago, this painting gave me permission to only paint foregrounds. Each skin of color I add presses forward and makes my studio smaller and smaller. If you think about it, every landscape painting is figurative because it implies the presence of the artist and the viewer standing in a fixed position, experiencing a view. In my new work, I'm using tangled, overlapping lines to create thickets through which light scatters like white-hot embers. I've been spending a lot of time slowly walking around oak trees to see how the branches create frames that open and close according to where I stand. As I move around the trunk, that which was hidden reveals itself. Like any journey, as soon as you take your first step, you've abandoned your starting point. Travel eliminates its origins. We are where we go. Here are two small Rousseaus, which I come back to year after year because of their opposing rhythms. For example, this one uses what he called planimetric design. Strips of color to suggest a predictable space that moves the eye from foreground grass to background clouds, one parallel plank at a time. Kind of like standing at the bottom of a staircase and looking up. Roman painters also used this design to evoke a sense of clarity and order. Conversely, this Rousseau uses a staggered zigzag pattern, which is energetic and wild, similar to what I'm doing in this new painting. The ruby red on the right plunges your eye diagonally into the interplay between the branch-like tangles in the foreground and the violet air that hovers above them. Then that teal trunk form catapults your eye back into the foreground. I love using extreme scale shifts from very close up to far away to lend the whole image a sense of movement or the promise of movement, as if something just happened or is about to happen. In contrast, this new painting uses gentle arcs of tone to cradle the eye in shallow space, to evoke a specific time of day and place. Dusk on Wambaugh Creek, South Carolina. But I'm not interested in painting trees, but treeness. I draw trees all the time with pencil on paper very realistically, not to make them appear, but disappear, leaving the visible vibration of their presence. That's my subject. In other words, I've spun the telescope around. I no longer peer through a tiny aperture at the greater universe, but through the wide end, in which the entire universe is compressed down to the size of a diamond and shot directly into my retina. I'm knocking on 57 years old, and I finally learned that painting is not about having more, but wanting less. Auguste Rodin said that sculpture is about the relationship between hollow and mound. I construct the space in my landscape paintings with that in mind. Every concave or receding space in my work is countered by a convex or bulging form. Think of pictorial space as a water balloon. If you squeeze one end, the opposite end swells. The hollow and mound principle also applies to light and shadow. For example, you can see how Rodin's molded surfaces on this hand reveal the influence of Impressionism, of using flecks of light and shade to model form. Rather than carving wood or marble, Rodin molded pliable clay and plaster with his fingers before making casts. He literally massages stubborn material into significant form. When you stand in front of a Rodin sculpture, you can feel his presence in every hollow and mound left by his fingers. What does this have to do with painting? Everything. There is no such thing as texture in painting. Lumps and ridges are merely evidence of a working brush. For example, opaque paint says something very different than transparent. I stack opaque colors like cadmium red or cobalt green to make the viewer engage the foreground. I use transparent colors like alizarin crimson or ultramarine blue to suggest background. Any color can be made transparent by lessening its opacity with a medium. I like Gamblin's Neo McGilp. It's a gelatinous alkyd resin that keeps the body of the color while making it more translucent. It's workable for hours and preserves the attitude of the strokes. Milkier colors suggest atmospheric distance, while bright, clean, opaque colors suggest the world right under your sneakers. Content in my paintings is a direct function of how near or far something appears from your face. This automatically implies the presence of the viewer, standing in a fixed position viewing the landscape image, as opposed to linear perspective, in which all lines lead to a vanishing point, regardless of whether the viewer is present or was killed in a folding couch accident. Unlike other mediums, such as literature, photography, and theater, in which the artist modifies and edits before we experience the work, a painting bears all of the tattletale evidence of its creation, whether the kernel of one color peeking from behind another, drips meandering to the bottom of a canvas, or the ghosts of the initial drawing. A painting is the physical consequence of one person's efforts, eternally in the present tense. When you make your presence part of the visual experience, you address the notion of authorship. This has a profound effect on the way in which the viewer relates to the work. For example, when I stand in front of a Jane Peterson painting, I feel her painting as if we are crafting something and discovering it simultaneously. Conversely, when I stand in front of a Keith Saunier light sculpture, I'm more aware of my body as it relates to the architecture of the room. Unlike with Peterson, my apprehension of the Saunier comes precisely from the lack of the artist's presence, and from the tension between familiar objects forced into unfamiliar configurations. I love the fact that no matter what separates us, we are still bathed in the same light. This notion always touches me when I see any minimalist work that uses light. Rodin wrote, "The sculptor must learn to reproduce the surface, which means all that vibrates on the surface: soul, love, passion, life." Sculpture is thus the art of hollows and mounds, not of smoothness or even polished planes. To achieve this, Rodin had his models walk around him as he made clay studies. As Kenneth Clark wrote, "Facts become art through love." A keen awareness of exterior surfaces, when handled with love, create a transfer of energy that reveal the inner life of the artist. Rodin combines symbolism and realism into a third thing that radiates a rage for life. As my wife Katie says, that ain't nothing. I'm a big believer in letting people do what they do best. No matter how fancy your smartphone camera is, it still won't get the tonality and evenness that a professional photographer can deliver. I have pillowcases full of dimly lit slides from the late 1980s when I tried to document my own work. I wasted so much money. I learned that it's better to live off peanut butter Cap'n Crunch for a week and splurge on good photography. You only get one chance to make a first impression. I've worked in art galleries, and I can tell you that a dealer won't be impressed with an iPhone shot of your painting leaning against the closet door. An unprofessional presentation tells a gallery a lot about your level of experience, or lack thereof, and what you might be like to work with. Present one body of work, between 10 and 15 images, and make sure they are stylistically related. A dealer won't care about portraits and landscapes and abstractions and puppies. They want to see focus and consistency. And always give credit to the photographer. I've worked with the same photographer for 25 years. His name is Steve Bates, and he's perfected a recipe for shooting my work. Steve shot all of the paintings in my website, books, and catalogs, and they speak for themselves. The day before he arrives, I touch up my wall with white latex paint so that it's easier for him to mask out the background. My walls are a disaster. I don't even notice them anymore. Then, Steve sets up special strobe lights at extreme angles on each side of the painting and uses a top-of-the-line digital camera and filters to balance out the light so that there aren't any hot spots. Here's one of my iPhone shots next to one of his professional images. You can see how even his is versus the harshness of mine. If you're going to go to the trouble to send your images to galleries, don't pick 1 or 2 galleries. Send them to 50. Professional photography shows them that you take your work as seriously as you hope they do. If you can't afford a seasoned professional photographer, then call a local art school and ask if there are any photography majors that would like a gig. It helps them get real-world experience. This past summer, NYU's Institute for the Study of the Ancient World on East 84th Street had an exhibition called Pompeii in Color, and it was better than eating bubble yum for the first time. These frescoes, painted in the 1st century, feel contemporary because they are representations not of the natural world, but the unnatural world, composed, idealized, and intensified in jeweled flecks of color. They do what painting does best: provoke radiance. To paraphrase historian Kirk Varnedoe, a photograph uncovers the truth in the accidental, whereas a painting uses elements of the accidental passed through the immediacy of the artist's touch. A photograph is a world found, whereas a painting is a world manufactured. It's kind of like a skid mark on the highway, indicates both object and action. A painting is the physical consequence of one person's activity, eternally in the present tense. As I roamed from room to room, I settled on this portrait. As usual, I was embarrassed because the feelings that I thought were my own were really those of someone else. Yet I recognized them. That's what great art does. Makes us recognize what we've never seen before. Art was invented the moment one human being drew another on a cave wall in Ice Age France 27,000 years ago. For the first time, we could stare at someone else's face without being implicated. Before, when a baby cried, a lover laughed, or a bison got pissed off, it prompted a reaction from the observer. Those cave dwellers probably knew what their faces looked like from reflections in water, but it wasn't until they drew an image of one that we saw ourselves for the first time. Stop for a second and think about how miraculous it is to see without being seen. How can a total stranger on Facebook blow me a kiss without ever meeting me in person? How can television put us inches away from a couple having an intimate conversation, yet we have no effect on their lives whatsoever? This is nothing new. In the to be or not to be soliloquy, Shakespeare lets us experience Hamlet's thoughts and feelings without him knowing we are there. Art is participation without implication. Art gives us an excuse to stare at each other. Although I was standing a few feet away from the painting in the exact same spot that the painter did, I had to bend the image through the prism of my own experience. In other words, a painting made in Pompeii in 39 AD is not the same as one made during the Charleston Renaissance in 1939, because their minds knew things that the ancients didn't. I'm pretty sure that we don't see an African mask or a Peruvian feather textile in the precise way that the artist intended it. So we have to invent new modes of seeing based on our own contemporary experience. Art is eternally in the present tense. What keeps it in the present tense is intent and execution. There should be no gap between what an artist expresses and how he or she expresses it. When the what and the how are perfectly aligned, the work transmits energy. When they're not, you got a refrigerator magnet. This portrait of Hank Williams by Howard Finster doesn't look realistic, yet it's so alive that it makes me blush. What's more real, accurate representation or feeling it in your bone marrow? Finster isn't hitting us in the ear with a polo mallet, and he isn't trying to be the smartest person in the room. He's simply saying, hey, come stand next to me. I have something to show you. Finster made it look so effortless. If your painting looks labored or overworked, quit. Just because a student spends 6 weeks on a history paper doesn't mean it's going to be good. There is compelling evidence that Mozart composed his scores with little to no editing, while Beethoven struggled mightily. Yet both produced complex and enduring music. The most important thing is that you be honest in your work. Whenever you are the most like yourself, you're automatically going to be good at it. An artist should gradually grow weaker so that the viewer can grow stronger. In other words, an eye, not told what to see, sees more. These Pompeian frescoes reminded me that art is the transference of deception, and we all crave deception in our lives. Art is not real life. It's manufactured emotion that gives us a momentary glimpse of lucidity. Ask any grocer when people give up their goals. They'll tell you it's the third week of January because that's when they stop selling kale. Never aspire to be an artist. That implies trying to win the approval of others. Simply declare yourself one. My paintings never look as good as the ones I see in my mind, but the next one might. So I keep showing up. Art is part skill and part crazy. Too much skill and technique comes across as dry and pretentious, while too much crazy without the chops to deliver it in tenable form is, well, crazy. When you experience any work of art, first ask yourself one question. How does it make me feel? For example, the seal-like forms of Constance Brancusi transmit a range of associations, but not as symbols. They go beyond. The surrealist René Magritte said, "If one looks at a thing with the intention of trying to discover what it means, one ends up no longer seeing the thing itself, but thinking of the question that it raised." Paul Valéry put it more bluntly. To see is to forget the name of the thing one sees. When an object functions as a work of art, it takes on a strangeness that evokes without representing. It expresses properties that it does not literally possess. Why listen to a critic trying to explain sweetness when you could just bite into a warm, raspberry-filled Krispy Kreme? That will tell you everything you need to know about sweetness. Plus, it's more joyful. These days, finding a painting that exudes joy is rarer than finding an empty LaCroix can. In our quest to find meaning in everything, we sometimes overlook reverie. You can't recognize beauty unless you've seen it. You can't take someone else's breath away unless it's been done to you. Edvard Munch's The Scream is arguably one of the most famous paintings ever made. But it's important to note that the figure isn't screaming, but covering his ears to block out the screams. In other words, be in the world, good and bad. Pay attention to what's going on around you. Then, do something about it. To inspire means to inhale, which speaks more of the body than the mind. In other words, get out of your creepy studio and go into the world. Judge your paintings by their relationship to things in the real world, not the art world. Let us peer through your eyes. Let us walk around in your shoes. Painting begins with your mental point of view, not your moral point of view. Art students are often conned into believing that their paintings must provoke thought. The more profound, the better. But I'm always suspicious of any painting that commands me to think before I feel. Galleries are lined wall to wall with paintings begging us to figure them out. But if you have to stand there trying to understand a painting, then you're denying what René Magritte called the mystery of the visible. Magritte goes on to say, "You can't speak about mystery, you must be seized by it." Now here's where it gets all pink and naked. Any pretentious clown can say, well, if you don't like my paintings, it just means that you don't understand their mystery. Wrongy Wrongenstein. Forget about essays and critiques and consensus for a minute. The first thing an artist must possess is a built-in bulletproof shit detector. You shouldn't have to have a secret decoder ring to read about contemporary art. And you shouldn't have to have a degree in theoretical constructs to look at a painting. All you need are 2 eyeballs and some time. Most people have a basic sense of visual harmony. No one tries to set an ugly dinner table or get dressed in the morning to look hideous. Aesthetics matter. Aesthetics improve the quality of life. Duke Ellington said, "If it sounds good, it is good." The same applies to things visual. If it looks good, it is good. The only way to make paintings that look good is to make ones that look bad. Make a ton of work and destroy all of it. To be a painter, you have to be smart enough to keep doing it and dumb enough to think that it actually matters. That's the best advice I can give you. No one cares. That's what freedom tastes like.